So each of you have a copy of the Gettysburg Address. This is out of the kindness of the Hill's heart. However, next month on your monthly bill, there'll probably be another $100 charge or whatever. The Battle of Gettysburg, which was fought on the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd of July, 1863, was the largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. It resulted in 50,000 casualties in 3 days. D-Day, the 6th of June, about 2,500 casualties. 9/11, about 2,400. Pearl Harbor, about 1,400. 50,000 Americans died or were wounded in 3 days. And of course, among those who were wounded, we didn't have helicopter evacuations. So this was the bloodiest day of the war up to that time, and actually even afterwards, for the 22 months that the war remained. It was a Union victory. The Federal Army, with its back to the wall, or back to Philadelphia and Washington and Baltimore, defeated the Confederates and sent them back to Virginia. It wasn't a decisive battle because the war went on for another 22 months, but at that time, in conjunction with the victory and capture of Gettysburg on the Mississippi, the Union cause looked bright and optimistic. In November of that year, there came the time to dedicate the cemetery for those who died. Among the Union soldiers, most were able to be identified, and if you recall, and perhaps even if you don't, most of the units fought in the name and on behalf of their states. So there was somebody from Minnesota or Vermont, and so the states contributed to putting together the Union portion of the graves at Gettysburg. The Confederates were just buried because obviously nobody was going to the Confederates and saying, hey, who is that guy? $50,000. So there was an occasion now to dedicate this cemetery. And as on most occasions in those days, there was going to be an oration. And unlike us who live in the 21st century, people in those days looked forward to orations. They were not in the tick-tock family of 10 seconds or 15 seconds, so they were prepared, ready, willing, able, and anxious to hear the orations. And of course, there were benedictions by various members of the clergy. There was a hope that the great poets of the time, Longfellow, Emerson, would produce something appropriate for the occasion, but they were unable to do so. So the oration was given in a 2.5-hour talk by a famous, quite famous orator, Edward Everett, who had been a congressman, a member of the cabinet, a senator, the governor of Massachusetts. And he did an oration which was designed to go through why the war was fought, what the war was about, why the Union was constitutionally correct, and to the extent that he could, from the information he had at the time, provide some idea of how the battle had gone. The president was invited to give what were expected to be and called some remarks on the occasion of the consecration of the graves. Now, Lincoln understood that he wasn't going to do the oration. He was going to give some remarks. Now, there have been myths, pure myths, that on the train from Washington to Gettysburg, he wrote it down on the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope, a sheer myth. He very rarely spoke extemporaneously. He was a craftsman of words. And as I will argue in a few minutes, what we're about to think about and what we're about to examine was, in my view, poetry, prose poetry. Now, I don't know about you, but in my day, I remember that I was required to memorize the Gettysburg Address. I see a couple of nods out there from people who have gray hair also. Lincoln thought carefully about what he wanted to say. And he understood that the point that was most important to him was not the war itself, and it was not slavery, and it wasn't the constitutional issues. It was something far more important to him and far more important to us today, the understanding of who we are as a nation, as a people, what we were about. In all of human history, nations, groups of folks, generally were founded on race or religion, language or common customs. And in all of human history, up to 1776, nations were ruled by an elite class of folks, monarchs, or what in our modern age of the 20th and 21st century we would call dictators. He understood that democracy itself, the concept that we, ordinary, everyday tradesmen, shopkeepers, farmers, and merchants, we had the right to govern ourselves. And that we were no part of a system that put people over us by some hereditary right. And today, we may think, and indeed it's true in some respects, that democracy is at risk. Certainly you don't have democracy in Russia, you don't have it in China, there's a lot of other places where it's under threat. But in those days, in 1865, there was only one nation that was founded not on race, not on religion, not on ethics, not on language, but on an idea. The idea that all men were created equal and they had certain inalienable rights. One nation. It was thought initially in 1789 that when the French Revolution started, it was going to be the American Revolution all over again, just this time in Europe. And what happened to the French Revolution? It dissolved into the Reign of Terror and to the dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1820, democratic rebellions were put down in Spain, in 1830 in Austria, in 1848 all across Europe. Democracy was not the default position of governments and societies. And here, now, in this one country that was democratic, it was in the process of committing suicide. What were the prospects then if societies like this one single individual society had no hope of functioning properly? If, in fact, it could commit suicide, what did that say about the rights of individuals? So if you look at the Gettysburg Address, which you have in your hand, what you will not find is the word slavery. What you will not find is the words Emancipation Proclamation. What you will not find are the words Constitution. And the reason is that Lincoln had a different purpose. He was speaking to a different point. He was speaking to us and to the people in front of him. There have been estimates that there were 10 to 20,000 in attendance. Lincoln, as you know, I think I've mentioned before, had a high-pitched tenor voice, but he could project. And he was heard. The folks who were there heard him speak. So what he was about to turn our view of ourselves and what we were about from a view just about the Union, just about the Constitution, just about this issue of slavery. He was there to point us to what the fundamental purpose and the fundamental risk we faced in the Civil War. In 1776, this free government was created. And over the years, from 1776 on, it was more or less administered. Millions of people came from around the world to live here because of this ideal of opportunity for the every man, for the every woman. And now it faced its greatest test. So we have before us the Gettysburg Address. 272 words. Almost all of them are short. But the sentences are not short. The sentences are complex. The sentences tie into each other. And he does this in a remarkable way. He leads us from our common past to what we are about at that moment. And to take from that moment the responsibility to move forward to make sure that the ideal upon which our nation was founded goes forth successfully. So this is a prose poem about dedication, about the dedication of those who gave and paid the ultimate price. To remember and honor them, but more to remind us of what our responsibility was, how we had to become rededicated, how we had to become recommitted to our own ideals. If you scan it, you won't see the words United States, but you will see the word nation. And what he was saying, we are a nation of diverse peoples founded for a single ideal. The ideal of equality and equality of opportunity. The equality to do what we had to do. You won't find the word I in the Gettysburg Address. It was not Abraham Lincoln as president who was going to save the idea of democracy. It was we. We and our are used 15 times. I was never used. So let's now, bearing in mind we are reading poetry, go back and take a couple of minutes to read again. And when I say poetry, you can think of the first lines, the first paragraph, and let me paraphrase it. About 80 plus years ago, some of our founders decided that they were going to meet in a convention and they were going to have an independent country free from a monarch, and they hoped the country would be based on the idea of equality, even though some of them were slaveholders. I mean, that's basically what Lincoln says in the first paragraph, isn't it? Where's the poetry? How did he grab you? 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. Not a bunch of states, not a constitution, a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. One sentence. Somebody's got a cell phone on. Herb, that you? Herb? That's where we came from. Where are we? Now we are engaged in a great civil war. Herb, please. Herb. Have you got it off? Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, and here we come to the dedication, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. We are here to pay homage to the sacrifice. Who made this sacrifice? Was it a professional army? No. Who made the sacrifice? Volunteers from all over the country. Men who gave up their wives and little children. Some 16-year-olds, some 14-year-olds, some 48-year-olds who volunteered to do what? To live in squalor, to march for miles without water, to be exhausted, drained, and then to face an enemy who had as many guns as you did, and stand in a line while they shot at you and you shot at them. For one moment, imagine what that meant, what that discipline meant, what that commitment meant. I'm standing here, and you're over there, 50 yards, 100 yards away from me, pointing a rifle at me, and I don't move so I can get a shot at you. And if I got shot, there's as good a chance I'm going to die on the spot or die of infection in the next hour or day or two as it was I'm going to survive any shot. But they stood there. They weren't, in 1863, drafted. They volunteered. Ordinary people, not commanded by some king or not commanded by some dictator, stand there and bled to death for an ideal. So it was proper to dedicate a cemetery to them. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow. And by the way, if you want to look again at the poetry, look at the triplet. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or to detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. So words themselves are not sufficient to propel us on to what we need to do, what we together need to do. It is for us the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they fought here thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. And now we're moving on from the present to the future. Now we're moving on from the dedication of this cemetery to the dedication of ourselves to the responsibility we have to our nation, which is our duty to uphold. If they could have bled and died, and we turn away, then they bled and died in vain. So we need to rededicate ourselves. Not from some dictator or king or monarch, but from our own commitment to who we are and what we are. It is rather for us to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us. And what is that task? He tells us that from these honored dead we take increased, devotion. Can you still hear me? Okay. To the cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, not from America, not from the Western Hemisphere, but from the earth. So what is it we need to do? What is Lincoln asking the audience to do? To rededicate themselves to the nation and to the ideal upon which it was created. So we're up to the Civil War. The United States was referred to in the plural. The United States are. From now on, the United States is. It's a singular. It's a singular because it's us. Nobody imposed this government on us. Nobody can run this government but us. We are free to fail. We are free to let these dead die in vain. But we are also free to carry on what they dedicated themselves to enable government of the people, by the people, for the people, to ultimately triumph, not just in the Civil War, but it's an ongoing struggle to make sure that we control our own destiny. So, Lincoln spoke for approximately 3 minutes. He spoke about the rededication to the nation. What was the reaction? Well, the poets Longfellow, Emerson thought it was a wonderful speech. Throughout the crowd, who heard him? Because when the president stood up, the oration was over and the focus was on Lincoln. They heard him. The feeling was being moved. That it wasn't his presence there at a cemetery, but that he had pointed out what was at stake. He pointed out our responsibility. So by and large, the response was excellent. It was what he wanted to achieve. It was a reframing of how we thought about ourselves. I think I've used the metaphor of the Declaration and the Constitution before. If I have, I'm repeating myself. But for Lincoln, the Declaration, the commitment to equality for all, was our purpose. The Constitution was a method of getting us to our purpose. And in 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, it was clear that equality for all meant equality for Negro African Americans. That slavery would rise or fall on the efforts that would be made by the Union armies going forth. For if the Confederacy won, then democracy lost. How could you have a democracy dedicated to equality for all if you have 4 million slaves? And from 1776 to 1860, this country avoided, delayed, evaded, denied what was inevitable, what was the inevitable choice. The problem with Jefferson, who was a fabulous writer, is when he wrote the Declaration and spoke about equality for all, he probably meant equality for all men except black men, and for all men who owned property. But that's sort of a long phraseology. And what he wrote was equality for all. Lincoln turned us from thinking about constitutionalism and states' rights to thinking about who we are and what is different about the United States. What makes us different? And what makes us different is the ideal upon which we were founded, and now upon which rivers, literally rivers of blood, were spilt between 1861 and 1865. 600,000 Americans died. 600,000. More than the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, combined 600,000. And the price we paid was simply unbelievable. And Lincoln talks about that in the second inaugural address, which will be my talk next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there questions or other tears?
Okay. We'll accept unintelligent questions, too. Andy, you have any unintelligent questions?
Right. You made me really think we were the only country, democracy.
At that point in time, the United States was the only democracy in the world. The only one. There was no democracy in Europe. So you're going to tell me, or some of you will say, well, the Swiss were independent. Yes, the Swiss absolutely were independent, but it wasn't a democracy. And none of the European countries were democracies in the 1860s. Even Britain, which was probably on the leading edge of it, was still essentially an aristocratic autocracy. Because the members of the House of Commons, even after the reforms of 1832, were still the wealthy. So, no, we were the only one. And that was well known. I mean, Leopold I, who was the king of the Belgians, who was the butcher of the Congo, understood and hoped that the United States would fail. The Spanish ambassador to the United States wrote to the Queen of Spain and saying, we hope that they totally collapse. It can only help us. That great liberal, Otto von Bismarck, who started out as a Republican in his youth, came to the conclusion that the only way you could govern was to govern by control, and control had to come from a monarchy. We were the only ones. And what's amazing about that, in a way, is in the 150 years or 175 years, I can't do the arithmetic, since the American Civil War, the world has changed. The world has changed. That country after country after country has adopted the same ideals we live with, or ought to live with. Some of them do it better than us. Some of them don't do it better than us. But the ideal is there. Any other questions?
Oh, I do. How? Oh, yes, great.
You said there were 50,000 casualties at Gettysburg. Do you know how many of those were deaths and how many recovered?
Well, I'm going to give you what I know offhand. I know 4,000 Union troops died, 18,000 were wounded, 5,000 went missing. The problem with giving you those figures is that among the wounded, most of the wounded tended to die. I mean, if you were shot in the leg, the medical, and there were doctors there really were, but it was not an era of antisepsis. That came 20, 30 years later. So what they would do is cut off your leg. Now, some folks survived that. A lot of folks didn't. So 4,000 in 3 days, and if you went 3 or 4 months afterward and checked on them, my guess is it would easily have been double. And it was worse for the Confederates. They had less resources and they were retreating. So they had a situation where the deaths were going to increase because the Union had Gettysburg, and then it wasn't far to Harrisburg or to Philadelphia. You could get folks to kinds of hospitals. I'm sorry, I can't give you a more definite answer, but
That's a good answer.
yes. Hold on, wait a second.
Wait a
Ann.
minute, wait a minute. Although your voice could carry, probably.
I don't have a real question, but I'm thinking about de Tocqueville,
Thinking about,
Alex de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America before the Civil War. So he had described what he saw, and therefore the world knew about it because they read. So I'm just asking the question, maybe we were the only democracy, but it was being advertised.
I'm sorry, my hearing aids aren't working. I know you asked a question about de Tocqueville, but could you just slow it down a little bit?
Slow down.
Slow.
So de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America.
1832.
It was, I guess, widely read.
Very well.
And therefore, I don't have a real question, but I was thinking that was sort of an advertisement for democracy. I just want your comments on how de Tocqueville had any relevance to any of this.
I'm not sure that he did. What had, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that his particular writing had any relevance, but to the extent that visitors came to America, and lots of visitors from Europe came to America, usually, obviously, wealthier people. There was almost a grand tour of America that these folks did. But the word got out around the world, really got out around the world. And when I say around the world, I don't just mean Europe, I mean China also. The word actually got out that this place was different. I can't tell you because I don't know whether the idea that this place was different equated to the word democracy, but I think that the concept was if you came here, however hard you struggled, you could move ahead. You weren't going to be bound by class lines, as was true throughout the world. Whatever you were born into, whatever group you were born into, wherever else you lived, that was it for all your life. And the word got out that this country was different. Remember, there was huge amounts of land. Huge amounts of land. It was just, hey, go over the next hill and chop down a couple of trees. But there was huge opportunity, and the opportunity was not class-bound. So that's not the best answer, but that's the best I can come up with.
That's great. Okay, I have an amorphous question too.
Okay, you're entitled to two questions.
Amorphous. Well, how they weren't drafted.
In 1863, in 1864, the draft began.
But how did they come forward to fight? I mean, what was it? Lincoln that brought them? What
Okay, so-
woke them up?
After Fort Sumter was fired on, President Lincoln issued a proclamation calling on the states to provide 75,000 militia for 3 months' service to put down the insurrection. And there was an outpouring, and I'm going to talk about the South in a second. There was an outpouring of over 100,000 volunteers. People just got up and recognized this is our country. They're trying to destroy our country. it's my responsibility, and went down into, and of course it was still largely rural. So went down to the local town center, and they organized militia companies. And they voted on who their officers were going to be. It was also true in the South, where the idea of Southern independence called forth, and this is beyond astonishing, called forth the Southern population, largely of which were non-slaveholders. And the young men in the South who owned a slave may have owned one or two slaves. The officers in the South owned tara and the big plantations and had 114 slaves, and they became colonels. But the Southerners rallied to the idea of independence. People understood what this was about.
How long do you think it took the general public to really realize how important this address was? And was it the last thing that the 20,000 heard that day?
Yes, but there was one final benediction. As to the last question. The public found out about it very quickly because there were reporters on the site. And the reporters had already developed that. I can't tell you when it was, but shorthand had been developed. And it was very well known. And we had the telegraph. So the reporters went and had taken shorthand notes of what Lincoln was saying and put it on the telegraph, and it was in the newspapers all over the country the next day. So it was very widely known very quickly, and it was also widely known not that much later in Europe, because there was an underground cable that was going from New York to London. It spread pretty quickly, and it changed the language, it changed the concept of what we were fighting for. When the war began, Lincoln was very clear, we're fighting for the Union. And as time went on, as I did in my last talk a couple of weeks ago, it became clear that to fight for the Union and uphold the Union and sustain the Union, you had to free the slaves. And now it took on a new character. We weren't fighting for the Union. We weren't fighting for the slaves. We were fighting for our own ability to govern ourselves. That's what this was about. From the time the Constitution was formed and the new government took office in 1789 to 1860, the presidency was primarily dominated by Southern slaveholders. And the Southern slaveholders also dominated the Senate. So the government of the United States, by and large, with exceptions, which is a long story to get into, by and large, with exceptions, was governed to protect slavery. The 1860 election was different. In 1860, the plurality of the American people decided it was time to constrain the growth of slavery into the territories. And what the Southerners did, they understood absolutely the point. If we let this go on, we lose control of the federal government. So despite a free and fair election, which the Southerners lost, they rebelled. That destroyed the idea of democracy. As much as your political opponent is repugnant to you, if they legitimately win an election, Well, they're in office for a term of office, unlike monarchies where the monarch lived until the monarch died. But there was a term of office, and you accepted that, except in a recent circumstance. But, yeah, it was widely known very quickly. Any other questions? I have one or two additional facts if you want to ask questions now. Thank you very much. Next week, health-wise, I hope to be able to make it for the last of the 4 talks, which will be on Lincoln's religion and his religious experience, and the second inaugural address, which is probably the most profound talk ever given by a president on any circumstance, including the Gettysburg Address. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so